Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on sanitation. My name is Dr. Marilena Excellent. I serve as a faculty at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill over the School of Gillings Global Public Health. It is my privilege this afternoon to welcome four amazing speakers who will really ignite us and inspire us about the hard work that has been happening in the field. Our first speaker will discuss the shared sanitation in informal settlements, a systematic review, meta-analysis, and primer for global monitoring standards with Lauren Sprouse, who's affiliated with the University of North Carolina. With no further ado, please help us welcome her to the podium. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be opening up this afternoon session today. My name's Lauren Sprouse. I'm a PhD student here at UNC, and I'm going to be talking about some recent work related to shared sanitation as a means of access to sustainable sanitation in informal settlements. So diving in 2022, the WHO and UNICEF Joint Monitoring Program, or JMP, reported that 570 million people relied on shared sanitation facilities. And these are toilets and latrines that are shared by more than one household. Shared sanitation is particularly prevalent in informal settlements, which are characterized by high rates of poverty, high population densities, a lack of space, tenure insecurity, and a lack of access to basic services. And this means that providing individual household sanitation facilities is often unfeasible in informal settlements. However, the JMP classifies shared sanitation as a limited sanitation type due to concerns over cleanliness, accessibility, and safety, though this isn't always the case. And in some cases, shared sanitation facilities might even be more hygienic than individual household latrines. And some studies have also sought to dispute this, arguing that high-quality shared sanitation could be considered an intermediate step in delivering sanitation services to informal settlements. And when looking at the context under which shared sanitation might be acceptable, there were uncertainties in the criteria for distinguishing between unacceptable and acceptable quality of shared sanitation. And there's also concerns over increased health risks, like diarrheal diseases and intestinal helminths, associated with the use of shared sanitation compared to individual household toilets. So given that shared sanitation might be the only viable option in informal settlements, we conducted a systematic review looking at informal settlements and how they relate to water and sanitation access, the drivers' user experiences and barriers to implementing shared sanitation, the impacts of shared sanitation on health, well-being, and the environment, as well as some potential indicators for assessing shared sanitation quality and inclusion in global monitoring standards. Okay, so for our methods, we conducted a systematic review and we searched 7 peer-reviewed journal databases and 10 gray literature databases and retrieved close to 5,000 articles. And our inclusion criteria covered really any aspect of shared sanitation, whether it be user experiences, sanitation quality, health outcomes, and more. And after removing duplicates and screening and resolving conflicts, we ended up with 259 total studies. And these 259 studies covered countries around the world, though mostly in Africa and Asia, and we also had 22 multi-country studies. We also found it important to distinguish among different types of shared sanitation. So for example, private or neighbor shared versus community shared versus public or institutional shared sanitation, where private refers to facilities shared among households living in the same compound, community shared among members of the same community, and public facilities are accessible to anyone in public locations like marketplaces, schools, or healthcare facilities. And our first objective aimed to describe informal settlements and how they relate to sanitation access. So informal settlements are characterized by overcrowding, tenure insecurity, inadequate access to basic services, and infrastructure, as well as poor quality housing. And we argue that these inherent characteristics of informal settlements drive the need for shared sanitation there. And when looking deeper into the prevalence of shared sanitation in informal settlements, we found that the prevalence ranged from around 34% in Indonesia to 82% in Bangladesh, though the highest prevalence by region overall was in southern and eastern Africa at 72%. And since we know that shared sanitation is common in informal settlements, we wanted to look at the associated user experiences and barriers to see how shared sanitation quality can be improved. So overall, cleanliness or perceived cleanliness was a key factor influencing user satisfaction with the shared facilities. And a lack of cleanliness, on the other hand, also acted as a barrier to shared sanitation use, where users may choose to openly defecate instead of using an unclean facility. Though other important factors included things like accessibility, which includes distance from the home, as well as accessibility for children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Privacy includes things like doors that lock, the walls and roofs don't have cracks or holes in them, and safety includes gender-separated bathrooms, adequate lighting, and more. And looking now at health effects, studies investigated several potential health effects, but we will use diarrhea as a representative example. So studies showed mixed associations between sharing sanitation facilities and diarrhea. And this ranged from no statistically significant differences in diarrhea among households using shared facilities compared to those with individual household latrines, to a higher risk of diarrhea among users of shared facilities, and one study even found a lower risk of diarrhea among households sharing sanitation compared to those with individual latrines. So generally, if we consider shared sanitation as a risk factor for diarrhea in many contexts compared to individual household latrines, but maintaining cleanliness and high hygiene standards can help minimize this risk. And a key limitation here is that most studies compared shared sanitation to individual household latrines, but they didn't compare really shared sanitation outcomes to open defecation outcomes. And this is an area for future research to really ensure that shared sanitation is an improvement, at least compared to open defecation. Other studies investigated health effects like helminth infections, maternal and nutritional outcomes, trachoma, and COVID-19. And most of these also showed mixed associations with shared sanitation compared to individual household latrines. And additionally, shared sanitation interventions might have a protective effect against some of these health outcomes. We also investigated several well-being related impacts, particularly those related to gender and violence. So for example, sanitation-related sexual violence was a common concern where women and girls were at risk of sexual harassment and assault while accessing shared sanitation, particularly at nighttime. It was common to have to walk 500 meters to reach a community toilet or up to 2 kilometers to reach a public toilet, though women reported safety concerns regardless of the distance walked. Other forms of violence and fighting were common, as well as psychosocial stress. So when sanitation facilities are perceived as unclean and they don't meet users' expectations of dignity, safety, and privacy, it ultimately leads to anxiety and stress. But when shared facilities are clean and well-maintained and managed safely, they can reduce these feelings of stress. We also found several examples of successful interventions to improve the quality of shared sanitation. For example, a randomized controlled trial in Lusaka, Zambia, focused on improving relationships between tenants and landlords as a way to improve cleaning schedules and safety and privacy. The MAPSAN trial in Mozambique replaced poor quality shared facilities with poor flush toilets and septic tanks and showed some success in reducing infections among children born into the study. And a study in Indonesia replaced hanging latrines with improved shared latrines using a community empowerment approach to make cleanliness really a shared responsibility. So ultimately, based on the success of shared sanitation interventions, we compiled a set of criteria that can guide effective management of shared sanitation. And these are somewhat similar to the JMP's criteria for an improved water source, where it's accessible on the premises, it's available when needed, and also free from contamination. But we also went above and beyond this to include things like privacy and safety, location, accessibility, structural quality, and management. And I'll get more into these specifics in a second. So rather than having all shared facilities classified as limited, we proposed this new classification that can fit within the existing JMP framework, where high-quality shared sanitation meets all the identified criteria. Limited sanitation refers to facilities that still hygienically separate human waste from human contact, but they may not meet one or more of the criteria. And then unimproved sanitation is the same as the current JMP framework, which includes unimproved sanitation technologies that do not ensure hygienic separation of human waste from human contact. So for our criteria, we developed this flowchart to determine whether a shared sanitation facility can be classified as high-quality shared sanitation, limited or unimproved. So for example, it asks simple yes/no questions as to whether the facility hygienically separates waste, if it's shared with other households, and if so, how many, if it's located within a shared compound, if it's accessible for all, including people with disabilities, if it's lockable and safe, and if cleanliness is either a shared responsibility or the task of a designated caretaker. And if all of these criteria are met, we could consider shared facilities as high quality. If one or more is not met, it could be limited, or if the facility overall does not hygienically separate waste, it could be unimproved. But these proposed indicators should be further validated to ensure they robustly evaluate all types of shared sanitation facilities. And we hope that these classifications could help incentivize investments in shared sanitation. In terms of next steps, we recommend gender-separated toilets for men and women, night lighting, lockable doors for privacy and safety, having consistent access to clean water within the facility, tiled floors that make it easier to clean, having cleaning and maintenance schedules, a dedicated caretaker to oversee operations. It should be accessible to all people, as well as have some sort of communication and problem-solving mechanisms in place. And for recommendations for policy, monitoring, and future studies, we recommend recognizing these most successful forms of shared sanitation as high quality rather than limited. And this could be whether in the JMP framework or on a country level monitoring scale. Though we do need to refine and field test these proposed measures to make sure they actually meet user priorities and effectively separate excreta from humans. Future research should also focus on the associations between shared sanitation and health outcomes compared to open defecation. And we need monitoring and evaluating of existing processes and infrastructure within informal settlements like shared housing and solid waste management to see how these shape the provision of shared sanitation. Thank you so much, and special thanks to these people, to our funder, Habitat for Humanity. You can scan the QR code to learn more about our research too.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Lauren. And now the floor is open. We'll take 3 minutes questions. Over to the floor. Please feel free to come to the mic. Thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot. My name is Matt Bentley, and I work at USAID, Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. I thought this was a really helpful presentation, separating out kind of the different levels of shared sanitation. I had one question on your criteria. How did you select 5 households or 30 people as kind of the ideal or minimum metric to achieve that higher quality shared sanitation?
Yeah, the 5 households or 30 people is kind of a baseline that has been previously established in literature, and it used to kind of be a criteria within the JMP framework. Though I would say the number of households or number of people isn't quite as important as whether those people know each other or if they're part of an extended family, perhaps. And that way, it's really if those people are able to organize themselves to establish a sort of cleaning schedule, to establish safety and privacy and things like that. So it is, yes, somewhat based on previous evidence, but also, whether or not they're familiar with each other.
Yeah, thanks. Just wanted to offer as well, you may not be familiar with the SPHERE standards, which govern humanitarian assistance and minimum standards of humanitarian response. And there are some guidelines for minimum numbers of shared populations that are very close to the ones that you mentioned there. But just wondering if there's maybe a body of research behind that could facilitate your work in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Any more questions or comments? Okay, let's again thank you.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. So we have our second speaker who will discuss animal ownership and waste management practice coverage in communities and associations with human health. Please help us welcome Caitlin Hemlock, who is affiliated with UNC Water and Health, with UNC. So over to you.
Sorry, can everyone hear me? Okay, yeah, maybe it's a little confusing. I'm actually affiliated with University of Washington. I'm currently a postdoc there, but this was some work that I did while I was at Berkeley. Okay, so for some background, we know that community-level latrine coverage, which is a human waste management solution, improves child health, particularly when analyzed among households in closer proximity to each other. We also know that backyard and domestic animals increase fecal contamination and child illness, but it's not well understood how community-level animal ownership and waste management affects health. In rural Nepal, most households are subsistence farming households where many own backyard animals and use their waste for agricultural purposes. Another unique aspect of the rural Nepal context is that biodigesters have been installed nationally as holistic household-level interventions. They are designed to replace wood-burning stoves and reduce indoor air pollution by producing biogas, and they do so by digesting human waste and animal waste, and they also output effluent, which can be used as fertilizer for crops. Human waste is piped to the underground biodigester from a latrine. You can see in the picture in the top right. But the animal waste requires manual input into an inlet, and the pictures on the bottom show that. And we found that in our study area, a third of households input most days per week. And most biodigesters in our study area were installed 10 to 20 years ago, and many have broken apparatuses for input requiring intense contact with the animal feces. Just going to show you a quick video. So this is the woman inputting animal waste into the inlet. The picture on the left is the inlet with the intact apparatus called an agitator. And the video on the right is from some qualitative work we did, which shows the process of inputting animal waste when the agitator is broken. The woman's trying to homogenize the animal waste with the liquid so it can go down the inlet. So we found this to be an interesting aspect of this context that warranted further investigation into animal ownership and animal waste management practices. So our research questions for this analysis are, how is animal ownership associated with human illness at the household level, if nearby households own animals, as well as at the community level? And then we also wanted to look into how animal waste management is associated with human illness at the household level and with nearby households' waste management practices. So for our methods for this analysis, we performed a cross-sectional survey in March to April of 2023. This was a census in 27 villages, which we conducted to enumerate the population for a subsequent in-depth household survey that we were doing on animal waste management and biodigesters. So they were selected for this purpose because of their variation in animal ownership and biodigester ownership. For those of you familiar with the area, the villages are approximately 70 kilometers east of the capital city of Kathmandu in the Panchkal and Mandandapur municipalities. The head of household was asked about the household roster and animal ownership and animal waste management practices. And because it was a census, we had limited information, or we asked a limited number of questions, but we added questions on household illness and socioeconomic status so we could leverage this data set for this analysis. Our exposures of interest included animal ownership and waste management at the household level, and there's a picture of a typical Nepali household. We used household GPS coordinates to extract information on animal ownership and waste management practices among households within 50, 100, and 200 meter buffers. And then we also looked at animal ownership among all households in the village to understand if perhaps illness was being affected in some environmental reservoir or other non-spatial characteristics. Our outcomes of interest were a 1-week recall by the head of household of diarrhea, which we defined as 3 or more watery stools in the last 24 hours, acute respiratory illness, which we defined as persistent cough, panting, wheezing, or difficulty breathing, and bloody stool, which is indicative of a more severe enteropathogen infection. Because our data was hierarchical in nature, we used multi-level logistic models with a random effect for village and household, and we adjusted all models for demographics and different proxies of socioeconomic status. Oh shoot, sorry. Okay, and here are results. So we obtained illness information on 5,772 people and found an overall prevalence of 3.5% for diarrhea, over 8% for acute respiratory illness, and less than 1% for bloody diarrhea. And as I mentioned before, we performed this survey in March to April, which is the end of the cold, dry season in Nepal, which is why we see more acute respiratory illness than diarrhea. And just to show you the distribution by age, illness is most common among younger children and as well as older adults. So first, we're going to look at our first set of research questions on animal ownership. First, some descriptives on household animal ownership. The majority of households own animals, with the most common being cows or buffalo, followed by goats and chickens. A small proportion own dogs and other animals, including cats, pigs, parrots, and rabbits. In terms of the number of animals, the most common was between 5 and 10 animals, and this was driven by chickens. And just to note that we ended up excluding commercial chicken operations if the household reported owning them, and we didn't have in our data set whether it was a commercial operation, so we talked with our partners and they said to use a cutoff if the household reported owning more than 100 chickens. And for dogs, most households own 1, with a few owning 2. Okay, so here are the results for our association with any animal ownership and at the household level and the prevalence of illness. Here I'm showing the association with owning each type of animal on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the prevalence ratio, where the null is 1. So more than 1 indicates more illness compared to households that do not own that particular type of animal, and less than 1 indicates less illness. So we found no associations with owning any animals, any goats, or any chickens, but an association with owning cows and buffalo and diarrhea that's marginally significant, a point estimate of around 1.5, meaning that households with any cows or buffalo had a 50% higher prevalence compared to households that didn't own any cows or buffalo. And the largest point estimate with acute respiratory illness is also among households that own cows or buffalo. And then we see this strong relationship with dogs and bloody diarrhea, and the confidence intervals are wide because owning dogs and reported bloody diarrhea were both rare, but the association is statistically significant. And now if we're looking at the association between the number of animals and the prevalence of disease, we have a similar setup to the previous slide. Here we did not include dogs, since nearly all households just reported owning 1 dog, and we scaled the total number of animals and chickens by 5. So these coefficients represent per 5 chickens or 5 animals and 1 cow or a goat. And we still see no association between owning goats and illness in green, but for chickens in the light blue, where we had no association with owning any chickens, we see an increased prevalence of illness, but only the association with bloody diarrhea is statistically significant. And the number of cows owned is now significantly associated with acute respiratory illness as opposed to owning any cows. Okay, so next we looked at animal ownership within nearby households within 50, 100, and 200 meter radii, indicated by the green, orange, and purple, respectively. And just to note here, the colors indicate the buffer sizes as opposed to the animals, as we saw in the previous slide. And the only significant relationship we saw was with households owning dogs, and the trend we see is actually opposite to what we expected. The relationship was stronger and significant only at the largest buffer, or the larger buffers, and this may have just be because there were less households that own dogs, so we're just capturing more variation in dog ownership at a larger buffer. And we see perhaps this similar trend in terms of the dose response with owning cows and buffalo, but otherwise no clear trends across buffers and animals. And also these estimates account for ownership by the household, so this is regardless if this household owned a particular dog. Okay, and lastly, we looked at animal ownership in the entire village, and we did not see any specific trends. Okay, now we'll look at associations with animal waste management. Some descriptives on household waste management practices. We found less variation than we expected. Nearly all households reported using cow, buffalo, and goat waste to some degree. And you can see that using the biodigester was most common for cow and buffalo waste. And this is mainly because of the ease to collect as well as the consistency. And collecting and removing and leaving the waste was more common among chickens and dog waste. So here we're looking at the association between the household waste management practices across the different animal types indicated by the colors and illnesses grouped on the x-axis here. And because of the lack of variability in waste management practices as well as the low prevalence of illness, we didn't have convergence for some of our estimates, but for biodigesters, we can see across the outcomes and types a trend of increased prevalence of illness, but no significant associations. And then, we found no clear trends among those that leave the animal waste where the defecation that occurred or those who collect and remove it. And then finally, we looked at the prevalence of biodigester usage among households within 50, 100, and 200 meter distances. And given the lack of variation in waste management strategies, we just looked at biodigester usage among those that use it for cow or buffalo waste. And we don't see any consistent associations across the illness outcomes, and I don't want to overinterpret. So based on these results, we believe that further investigation in this context is needed, particularly the mechanisms by which cow and buffaloes increase illness. Previous work has shown that ruminants contribute to household fecal contamination. However, here many households have animal sheds or keep them confined in the yards. We'd also like to look further into the dynamics between dogs and humans and associated contamination in the community, especially since we were unable to account for stray dogs here. And finally, biodigesters and the mechanism by which they affect household illness. Another study in the same study area also found an increase in diarrheal illness when recent biodigester usage was reported. Some of our limitations, one is that we did not consider altitude or topography. One of our hypotheses for village level contamination was potential runoff, and as you can see from the picture on the right, the area is quite hilly. However, since we performed this survey in the dry season and thus we didn't consider seasonality, this may have not been an important factor in our results. We also use reported illness data, however, we don't expect differential reporting based on animal ownership or waste management. And finally, for our exposure measurements, we were unable to capture the presence of dogs in the area that were not actually owned by the household. And also, as we know, animal ownership may not be the best proxy for exposure to animal feces. As you can see by the diagram at the bottom, ownership of animals is the most distal proxy to our exposure of interest, and it doesn't actually consider who's responsible for managing the waste and their relationship with young children. So our next steps are to analyze our in-depth household survey and our environmental samples. From the census, we enrolled 302 households with children less than 5 in May to June of 2023. And the details are on here, but we have more information on the frequency of all the tasks related to the different animals owned, as well as the child's interaction with the animals, including stray dogs in the community. And then among households with biodigesters, we asked questions related to ownership and use, and also collected samples from the effluent, which we have banked. So we're looking forward to those results. And I'd like to thank all my collaborators and funders, and happy to take any questions.
your work. You were getting at this during your discussion of limitations, but I'm just curious. It's clear that, well, it may be clear that animal ownership is not a good proxy, the best proxy for interaction with animals or exposure to animal feces. I'm wondering if you discussed other ways to get at that animal interaction and whether in this particular area that seemed like a source of exposure if animals are just kind of wandering around.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the animals are kept in their household area. In Nepal, there are not compounds. There are defined households, and they usually have animal sheds. In terms of your point about animal ownership, you're completely right, and this data set was limited in the questions we asked, but that's why in our in-depth household survey, we're really looking forward to digging more into those dynamics.
Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I'm wondering, for the animal management behaviors that you were talking about in terms of compost and biodigester use, given the really high and low prevalence of those behaviors in the community, would some sort of quasi-experimental approach work to compare households that do with the smaller group that don't, or are there some sort of structural factors that explain the really high and or not really high, but 80% use of compost, but not 20, and then the 20% use of biodigesters, but not the other 80, you know?
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And we've been trying to think about who is targeted. So just some background, these biodigesters were targeted to specific villages, but then who took them up in the villages was self-selected. So as of right now, there are some new biodigesters that are slated to be installed. The ones that we're looking at here, we started delving into this specifically because they were older and broken down. Another issue is that the earthquake that happened in Nepal in 2015, these are concrete structures underground, and we're kind of concerned about leaking both untreated waste as well as methane too. So yeah, we're trying to figure out more of the dynamics, but I think that would be a good idea to take that approach.
All right. Awesome. Our third speaker is Swaib Semiyaga from Makerere University. And the presentation will cover black soldier fly larvae for treatment of fecal sludge from peat latrines in informal settlement. And over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. You are scaring me, okay, but now at least I know you are there. I want to take this opportunity to welcome you to this presentation of black soldier fly larvae for treatment of fecal sludge from peat latrines in informal settlements. And the study was done by quite a number of people. I think those underlined are the ones present in this conference. Okay, Chimdi, you can say okay, okay, and Musa is outside there. Okay, but I want you to move with me to Kampala, where the study was done, and I want to welcome those who have not been to Kampala. This is just the capital of Uganda. And it is found in East Africa. And the situation in Kampala, when you look at the right, we have the formal and the informal settlements. But the informal settlements account for about 60% in accommodating the residents of Kampala, who are about 4.8 million people out of 45 million Ugandans. That's over 10% residing in Kampala. Okay. The situation, what actually comforts me, that the situation you are seeing for informal formal settlement for Kampala is not only in Kampala, but quite around the world. We have a number of them. So that at least gives me comfort that we are also with others, okay? And meaning also the solutions we are talking about are not only beneficial to us, but they can also be beneficial around the world. But what's the beauty about Kampala? The beauty is the 60% you've seen in Kampala, the dependence on on-site sanitation actually is really high. The sewerage is just about 10%, so meaning the rest in Kampala is on-site. And that being on-site, the biggest fraction of on-site for Kampala slums is a pit latrine, okay? And for those who have not seen a pit latrine, these are some pit latrines. We have really those of also very good quality, but the common ones in slums, those are constructed by the owners of households, are really something like that. And the biggest problem, that technology in Kampala, if you look at slums, is over 80%. Yeah, so it's really important for us to talk about it because of the number of people there. And the key way of managing, next time if you get a time to go through some slums, like in Kampala, you look close to the drainage channel. You'll see toilets lining up on a drainage channel. It's strategic, actually, because they find it easier to dump in drainage channel, really pathetic, and this is not something that we really want. And the kind of sludge, if you look at these facilities, it's really a bit, okay, sorry. The kind of sludge, if you look at these facilities, it's really different from a number of facilities, maybe like septic tanks, majorly because of what is being done in slums. A number of them deposit solid waste in slums, and in pit latrines, and the nature of facilities. So you find that the consistency of sludge is really actually different. And actually, we came to think about some alternative solutions of managing this within slum. The idea of using black soldier fly larvae, one, it has been commonly used in management of solid waste, and actually we got this idea mainly from the piloting of using black soldier fly larvae in Kampala. That is for KCCA when they were piloting managing organic solid waste. And actually, the level of success for the pilot, the need for the black soldier fly, the spaces required, what this really inspired to see that this is something that could be of importance when it comes to our slums. But we had to first get to the reality of the kind of substrate or the fecal side that is coming from these facilities which are in the slums. And hence this kind of a study of going into the pit latrines which are found in slums. And when we talked about pit latrines, this encompasses lined and unlined pit latrines. So this study was in lined and unlined pit latrines, okay? Now, the key questions we had in this study, one, we wanted to first know what are these characteristics and how different are they? That's the lined and unlined pit latrines, and also how adequate is this fecal sludge in rearing of black soldier fly larvae. We also able to look at another question of what would be the optimal feeding rate and larvae density. Some of these have been done on other substrates like solid waste, as I said, but we need to understand really what's happening with this sludge from pit latrines. And then at the end of the day, we are able to set up experiments. After characterization, we are able to set up experiments, getting samples of fecal sludge from lined and unlined pit latrines, setting up different experiments, and then feeding the larvae using different kind of density, okay, added to a different kind of quantity of sludge. So the experiments were performed. And then the third question we had also was, can these larvae be able to work without interfering, like with sludge characteristics? You know, the sludge, we have varying moisture levels, and we knew that the optimal for the BSF to work well was 60. So we wanted to see really if we are to implement this in slum and easily upscale it, don't we need to interfere with sludge, with watering, and so on? Can we be able to see also how it works over a wide range of moisture content? And we also tried another experiment of looking at different levels of moisture content and also how this BSF was performing. And then finally, the residue that comes out, we also wanted to know, really, if you look at some of the uses or potential uses of this residue in slums, can it be can it compete with compost that can be used in slum? We're also able to take the characteristics and compare. And these were really key questions to kickstart the kind of discussion that I'll talk about later. Now, the first question of characteristics, we're able to look at a range of them, ranging from physical, chemical, heavy metals, and heavy metals. And actually, we're able to find out that in lined and unlined pit latrines, the characteristics could be comparable to those required for rearing black soldier fly larvae, looking at the requirements in that column. Then after that, we went ahead now to launch experiments with lined and unlined pit latrine, faecal sludge. And when you look at that, we're able to see actually that there was really a substantive reduction in quantities. And this reduction was increasing when we are increasing also the larvae, the larvae density. Okay, and then we're able to see that if you look at the optimal was occurring at feeding rate. That was at feeding rate of 50 milligram per larvae per day, and the larvae density of 1.33 larvae per square meter. But what was important for us here is to know that though we are seeing that the reduction was more in lined and unlined, but it was not statistically significant. Okay, so we went ahead to look at, as I said, the variation in moisture content. And in variation moisture content, we were able to look at the 60, which was optimal, going ahead up to about 80, which we found as moisture content common moisture content for fecal sludge from pit latrines. And we are able also to see that actually, yes, at the reported optimal for other substrates of 60, yeah, we are doing well. But even at other ratios of moisture content of 70, 80%, also the efficiency, we had some substantive efficiency. And of course, this now goes back to what we want, or looking at the economics of dewatering vis-a-vis the recovery rate that we can have. And again, you can see that definitely we can easily depend. So even if it's 80%, the reduction is not so much to guarantee intervention of other technologies. Now, we went ahead and characterized the resulting residue and comparing it to the limits required for composting. And we really see that a number of characteristics we are passing, just save for the helminth eggs. The helminth eggs were not passing. But in brief, this kind of experimentation was able to make us with some interesting conclusions when it comes to black soldier fly larvae with pit latrine, mainly lined and unlined pit latrine sludge, say, yes, now this could survive, and we could have some substantive reduction and treatment within slums where we do not have spaces for large plants, or where it becomes challenging to transport to fat treatment plants. But now this also gives us a number of questions which we are ready to consider when the funding is there. And some of these are mainly on, is it possible to do co-management of the solid waste, because this is also another big issue that we have in slums, and most of the pit latrines are also really having solid waste. So it's another thing we need to look at in doing co-management and seeing how the BSF behave. And then at the end of the day, it's important also to look at the different ways of sanitizing the black soldier fly larvae, making it for resource recovery when it is safe, okay? So this is something that is important for us to do, and also looking at the full-scale models. Models right from the emptying to managing to the end use, the different models that could be practical when it comes to informal settlements. And what we cannot forget, the pathogen flows along the management chain of it, so that the people also working with BSF and the environments where it is being worked on become safe. So this is, we couldn't do so much in just the 12 minutes, but for those who want to read in detail about the findings, or these initial findings that I've just talked about, the paper was published. You could use the code to get the publication for the results. I want to really thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Swaib. And the floor is open for questions, please.
Hi, I'm Cassie Morton from the Nature Conservancy. And touching on your last bullet about pathogen flows, I'm just really curious. First, thank you. This is such an interesting approach to fecal sludge management that I do not know anything about. But considering disease transmission from flies from human waste, I'm just curious what happens when the larvae hatch.
Okay. Can I answer, or to first have more questions? Okay. Okay. What happens when the larvae hatch? Actually, there is I may not explain a lot, but there is some good literature about black soldier fly larvae. Black soldier, the fly in the mature state, it does not move. Okay, they are in one place. They keep on mating, laying eggs. Okay, so they don't move like, say, from the fecal matter to food and something like that. So that is something interesting for you to read about, you know, the life cycle, and I think that's what makes it something interesting in line with disease transmission. They don't transmit diseases. Okay.
I'm too small for this.
Yes, you can adjust, Karen.
I'm Claire Furlong from IHE Delft. This is a great presentation and it's really interesting. I was wondering if you could speculate, or perhaps on the use of the black soldier fly larva within perhaps Kampala or within Uganda. What markets are there? What can it be used to, what can you transform the larva into?
Okay, that's really interesting, and these are some of the things we are thinking about when it comes to the slum environment, looking at what could be important, and then looking at those pathways. But at the moment, they are used as animal feeds, and as I said in the beginning, that what sparked off this study was the pilot of these flies with organic waste from the municipality, that is from Kampala. The larvae, so the prepupa, which is harvested, is actually having a high market. They always take it. So they harvest it, wash it, dry it, and then crush it into powder, and then they always, the farmers always come for it. It's something really interesting, and some interesting way of how we can manage waste, yet also these we use in managing have a market. Okay, that's one of the potential management pathways. Okay.
Again, thanks. Thank you. Awesome. Last but not least, okay, so we have Chimdi, I hope I got it right, who is our fourth presenter for this session, and the presentation is about Biochar has a novel technology for on-site domestic wastewater treatment, a critical review. Over to you. Thank you, and she's with UNC Chapel Hill.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Chimdi Moalu. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering here at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm giving a presentation on my paper, which I did with Dr. Swaib and Dr. Musa, which is on Biochar as a novel technology for on-site domestic wastewater treatment. Now, introduction. If you look at many low and middle income countries, as well as rural areas in the United States, they usually make use of, or because of, they do not have access to centralized wastewater treatment systems. They make use of on-site wastewater treatment systems, like your cesspools, like your septic systems, for treating their domestic wastewater. However, the way these systems are designed are in such a way that they do not effectively remove inorganic contaminants, like your heavy metals, like your pharmaceutical, or organic contaminants like your emerging contaminants. They are not designed to effectively remove it. This implies that you have large quantities of ineffectively treated wastewater being released into the environment. Not only does this affect the environment, it also has an impact on public health, necessitating the need for post-treatment steps. Now, one way we can use, or one method we can use for treating this wastewater is through the use of biochar. We can use biochar because of its rich surface characteristics. However, if you look at sewage sludge or sewage treatment, or what you have in your centralized wastewater treatment plant, biochar has been studied for its treating it. However, when it comes to domestic wastewater, it's still nascent, and there's still so many gaps. What are the mechanisms? How effective is it? And that's what brought about this systematic review, this critical review. And the big question then is, how effective is biochar in removing contaminants from domestic on-site wastewater? Given the distinct characteristics between biochar, between domestic wastewater, which is on-site, and that carried by the sewer, what mechanisms influence the removal of these contaminants from on-site domestic wastewater when you compare it to that of your normal municipal wastewater treatment? And we also want to look at what are the gaps there for on-site domestic wastewater. Now, before I continue, I want to really describe what do I mean by this biochar I keep on talking about. Biochar refers to solid carbon-rich residue gotten from the pyrolysis of biomass. Pyrolysis meaning that you are combusting material in the absence of oxygen, but at very high temperature. So now when you are trying to make biochar, the first thing you have when you're making biochar is what materials or what raw materials can you use for producing biochar? First, you can use wood, you can use food waste, you can use sludge, anything that has carbon, because it is it's based on carbonization. And then you have it being treated in a pyrolyzer, something that you don't have oxygen. You're using maybe nitrogen or argon in that atmosphere at very high temperature, going between 300 to 1,000 degrees C, for you to be able to produce biochar. And then based on the conditions with which it is being produced, you have it having rich functional groups. You have pore spaces for absorbing contaminants. And then you have large surface area. Let me illustrate something here. When you have large surface area, I mean you're saying when you compare it to your normal sand, so you have something as high as 180, for raw biochar, 180 square meter per gram. But when it comes to sand, it's like 0.18 square meter per gram. You can see the distinction in the characteristics. Now, though this was a critical review, we tried to put in a bit of methodology to make it semi-quantitative. So we went to look for articles using Boolean searches when you have and or in databases like Google Scholar, PubMed, Web of Science, and then it allowed us to be able to make it such a way that it's narrative to get relevant data from it. Now, from the results and discussions, we had like 24 studies on the use of biochar for the treatment of domestic wastewater. So you're talking about grey water, septic tank water, black water, and we also noticed that most of these studies were on lab scale. They were carried out in the lab scale. And about half of these studies made use of spiked domestic wastewater. So I would say domestic wastewater, but when you spike, it means that you're taking the contaminant and you're putting it into maybe you have tap water or distilled water, and you're just putting your contaminants just to see how effective it is in removing the contaminants. And then we saw that so many studies talked about organics, but not so many talked about heavy metals and ECs. So these are results that we have. And you can see that for most of these, looking at these pharmaceuticals and personal care products, what you see is that most of them usually have greater than 50% removal. And if you look at Kappa, MAP, Zepin, you can see that, okay, its removal is not so high. So now you have pristine biochar, which has not been modified or anything, having this very high concentration or high removal. But because capamazine is something that is in wastewater, it's usually is hydrophilic. It's well dissolved in wastewater, so it can't just be removed easily through adsorption. You have to modify it. And then looking at pathogens, these are ranges for removal of pathogens from your bacteria to virus to protozoa. Now, coming back to the mechanisms, if you look at your on-site wastewater or where you have the effluent from your septic systems, you have three things. You could have nutrients, you have organics, and you have all these emerging contaminants. All of them are competing for that adsorption site, because biochar works with the use of the adsorption site, because when you have these pharmaceuticals or ECs, they cannot be removed easily by biodegradation. But if you have an adsorption site and you can modify the adsorption site, you can easily remove all these contaminants. So because they are all competing for this, one thing when it comes to on-site domestic wastewater, it involves two things. You have adsorption and biodegradation. So now biochar has a large surface area. It has pore spaces. The large surface area allows biofilm to be able to build for microorganisms. The pore spaces, you have organics within these pore spaces. And then the biofilm or the microorganisms feed on these organics and keep on growing for the degradation of contaminants. And that's how it works in synergy. So you have biodegradation and at the same time you have adsorption. Now, so we've looked at studies, we've seen what have they talked about, how efficient it is. We see that there's still some things that still need to be done with the use of biochar for treating domestic wastewater. First, you see that most of these studies are done in the lab scale or spiked water, but when you come to real field conditions and you compare it to lab conditions, they are different. So now I want to see, can we pilot this in field conditions to see how effective it can be in removing contaminants? Also, trying to look at, because you look at biologically modified biochar, can we bioengineer biochar whereby you have microorganisms on top helping to remove organics? Or can we even look for those microorganisms that can degrade these ECs in the wastewater so that we don't have to modify with chemicals and all of that? These are things we should be looking at. And then now we are in the Water and Health Conference. ARG, antibiotic resistance, genes, antibiotic resistant bacteria is a big factor. And they are in high concentrations in domestic wastewater. How can we use biochar for their removal? And also, now we talk about on-site wastewater treatment systems and their effluent, and so we say septic tanks, we say cesspools, but we also have pit latrines, we also have pit latrines and all that kind of poor flush toilets and all of them in other low and middle income countries, So how can we extend the use, or how can we see biochar for the treatment of these kinds of systems? So thank you very much.
Wonderful. The floor is open for questions, please.
Hi, Claire Furlong from IHE Delft, and the microphone is now perfect for me.
Okay.
I just wanted, I have lots of colleagues that work on biochar,
Okay.
and quite often what they tell me is that the term biochar, not all biochars are the same. So they're generated from different carbon sources under different conditions, and that gives them different kinds of properties.
Yes.
So I was wondering, in your study and your review, did you look at that and look at how the biochar was made and what material it was made from, and looked at how that could be used to remove or to find a biochar for a specific kind of pollutant?
Present in the waste space. So when you're trying to make biochar, there's so many conditions. So you say it has large surface area, you want the porosity. So many factors influence how it has all this large surface area. Now, first thing is temperature. How high your temperature is also influences the pore spaces. And because you're looking at adsorption for the removal of contaminants, so your temperature has a big effect. Another thing is the feedstock type. So biochar works on, pyrolysis works on carbonization. So you're looking for something that has high carbon content if you want to be able to get high yield of biochar. So now you could use wood, which is lignocellulosic and has lignin content, which has high carbon content. And then you could use sewage, but sewage does not have very high carbon content. So that's also another factor that influences the pore spaces and the surface area within your biochar. So your heating rate is also another factor that influences the biochar. And then if you look at biochar, if you're removing contaminants from biochar, so the main things are, one, what are the functional groups on the surface of biochar, especially when it comes to emerging contaminants? Because it's not that all of them just adsorb to the surface of the biochar. No, you can modify your biochar, or if you say, okay, we have this functional group that we need, or we need this particular charge on the surface of biochar to be able to remove. So take, for instance, you're trying to remove heavy metals from biochar. Heavy metals means that you should be able to you can have ion exchange, because these are ions, cations, and anions. So you should be able to, if you can, let's say I'm trying to remove what kind of lead? Lead is Pb2+, and then I can make my biochar surface to be anionic. That means you're having negative charges on it, so that both of them will be able to, there'll be ion exchange there. So there are so many factors that can influence. So it depends on, I would say, if you're going to treat domestic wastewater and on-site wastewater, let's look at the characteristics of this on-site wastewater first. What are the contaminants that we can see in it? Then we can say, okay, how do we produce the biochar based on the factors, and then how can we modify to remove contaminants?
Awesome. Please help us thank Shimji. Now I would like to invite all the speakers to the front, and we'll pen the floor. So you remain at the mic, please. So we have Lauren, if you're available still. Okay. And then we have Caitlin, Shimji, Swaib, please. The floor is open again.
Okay, thank you. My question is to Cindy. Thank you very much for this research, and I think there's a lot of carbon materials, especially in areas and in the developing countries, which we could put to use in treatment of water and wastewater. While we are experimenting a bit more novel approach in wastewater treatment, I think it's slightly older in treating plain water, potable water, for removing of contaminants, and there have been several experimentation for a slightly longer period using biochar in potable water treatment. There are some lessons, successes, and failures that we can draw from extensive use of biochar in treating potable water, and which we can take into wastewater investigations.
Okay, for treatment of potable water, I think it's mostly like when you have activated carbon and all that for treatment of water, potable water. But for wastewater, in municipal wastewater, there are a lot of studies in using biochar for the removal. And also, if, I don't know if I can go back to my slide based on the efficiency in removing contaminants like your Muslim. Even from our study that we carried out, this review, we had some case studies on studies that people had carried out in removing contaminants from wastewater, and there were a few pilot studies that were very effective for using biochar for removing contaminants. Please, did I answer your question? Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. I think I have two questions to Chimdi and probably a question to Lauren. So this conference talks about science, policy, and practice, and you're talking about very exciting technology to use to treat wastewater. Have you thought through what could be the way to implement such or use such in the day-to-day life? That's one. Two, one of the key requirements of using to pyrolyze some of these, you need to have dried it very well, and you listed faecal sludge as one of that you want to use to carbonize. Have you thought through the cost involved in drying these and how labor intensive it is before you apply it into a real life? That's my question. Those are my two questions.
Let me start with faecal sludge. So you have faecal sludge having very high moisture content in it. But also, if you look at faecal sludge has very low carbon content. So now why don't we take sawdust, which has very high carbon content and very low moisture content, and co-pyrolyze with faecal sludge if we want large quantities of biochar, and if we want something that has very high pore spaces for absorbing contaminants. Then the first question, which deals with how can we use it in the field when you have biochar. So I'll give the instance of where you have a septic system. So you have your septic system, which has its septic tank and your leach field for treatment of the wastewater. So now, if we have the septic tank, we have the effluent coming from the septic tank, why can't we put the biochar to be like a filtration system for removing the contaminants? And looking at biochar, the raw materials for producing biochar, so you can have faecal sludge, you can have wood, sawdust, and all these wood chippings that just, so waste materials. So it serves as a way whereby you have very large available raw material for producing it, and you can produce it in large quantities.
Thank you. I think my last question goes to Lauren. Lauren, I'm from I'm from a different session, and they have been sharing with us some exciting results about shared private sanitation services, where it's a long kind of trial that's been running on, and after 5 years, they have showed us that shared private sanitation has an impact in terms of health, that it helps to improve health, and we're looking at the cohort that they enrolled in the study. When you presented your results, you gave us a criteria which had so many things to think about, and thank you so much for doing that. The question to you is, have you found any studies in your work that have actually tried to show a similar way or similar results to what they have shared with us in a different session? And two, is there a way you can incorporate such interesting findings and management into your index that you're proposing to us to take up for use in practice? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. I think in general, most of the studies we included in our review compared shared sanitation to the use of individual household latrines in terms of health outcomes, and they showed mixed results overall. However, we can pretty much assume that using some sort of high quality shared sanitation is better than having no sanitation at all. So I think that comes into play in our indicator matrix, where we have the first question is, does the technology hygienically separate the waste from human contact? And I think that accounts for the health effects that we see. If the pathogens in the waste aren't entering back into the environment, then we should see a reduction in health effects.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Barbara from KNUST. My question goes to you. You did a good presentation on the biochar, and then I wanted to find out more, especially when it comes to wastewater treatment. It's a huge challenge in low-income countries. For instance, in my country, and I recently did some work with using locally available materials. So I think that biochar has been so much been researched into, and so now the focus is on looking at the locally available materials, just like agricultural waste, how we can use that to produce this biochar. You can talk of coconut shell carbon, corn cobs, which are already being dumped somewhere else with no proper use for them. So we could use that and then maybe improve it and then use it to solve local problems. Maybe we can start thinking about that and then look at how efficient we can develop these materials and then use them as a means of treating wastewater. Thank you very much.
Okay, I also wanted to add something that when producing the biochar, you don't have to use, it doesn't have to be a sophisticated equipment for pyrolyzing it. So you can have just your simple, how would I say, you just have this simple drum or something that you can heat the material in. Oh, just a simple drum that you can heat the material in for producing the biochar. Thank you.
Do we have more questions or comments?
One quick one for Dali, right?
Yeah.
I like your presentation, honestly, and you did me proud. I just realized that you are from Nigeria.
There's some bias here.
No bias. Honestly, good presentation, and I love the way you have responded to the question sincerely. I have to say that, yeah, not because of bias, but that's the way it is. So, you talked about biochar, and I looked at other measures by which you can treat wastewater. Have you thought about macrophytes, like plants? Looking at developing countries, you know, the process of producing or setting up biochar and all of the things you have mentioned, to some developing places, it looks like technical, and much more in terms of funding of cost to putting all of this together is a lot. So what of other treatment measures when it comes to wastewater treatment system, particularly wetland?
Okay. Let me get back to wetlands. Okay, so when you have your wetland, sometimes you also have soils within the wetland.
Yeah.
So now, as I said, now you have these emerging contaminants, you have all of these things that you cannot remove by biodegradation easily. And also for soils, the surface area is not so large compared to when you have biochar. So it might not be so effective in, even if you look in literature, you will see that people put biochar in constructed wetlands for removing contaminants. Yeah.
Well, depending on the...
And then for, what's the name, for macrophytes, whether you want to use, I guess you want to do phytoremediation.
Yes, plants like water hyacinths,
yes.
Duckweeds, lemna, what's their names now? They are all, good plants also that can,
help to...
because there's also a symbiosis between the plants and whatever you are trying to, take away as pollutants, so to say, in wastewater treatment. So that's why I'm just looking at the technology, something that, persons can easily, resonate with. But sincerely, your approach, I appreciate it. So keep the flag flying.
Again, bias. Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you.
And that will be our last.
Yes. Thank you. My last comment was to Dr. Swaib about the black soldier flies. This is a very interesting concept, which has been piloted around for some time. But I think we have failed to move from experimental to scale. What's your opinion on how we can take this forward? It seems really idealistic. It's very ideal. You have the flies, they eat the waste. The waste is gone, and then you have the larvae, which you can also use beneficially. But we are failing to move this on from our experimental setting to where we can actually apply it for communal use to big scale. Well, what's your comment on that? Do you see that happening in the future, or are there limitations that could take us to scale with this approach?
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now, for scaling of this technology, there are a number of factors involved. After having evidence, and also after performing additional experiments, for example, the ones we've talked about, and there's a proof of concept that using black soldier fly larvae and faecal sludge is an ideal solution, then other people have to come in. So for example, we have to work, if it's in a city, for example, there is a need to interest the authorities, because these authorities are responsible for managing slums, or responsible for sanitation within slums. So if these people can buy up the idea, then this is something that can easily be done. A simple example is the interest of using the black soldier fly larvae on organic waste, which I talked about in Kampala. Now, the authorities were interested in alternatives of managing organic waste because it was a lot in their waste streams. And they took an extra step to look at some of these technologies. And even they piloted, as I said, and they are looking at having it as one of the options in managing waste. Now, this kind of a move can make this kind of technologies, not only BSF technology, but even all other technologies, to move just right from the lab to application. So I think this is something that we really need to do to interest the responsible, the organizations responsible, or the authorities responsible, and then they take that extra step, and then we can be able to apply this kind of technologies. As a researcher, I think I have a limit where I can go. We have limits, and then others can take it up from there. Okay.
All right, I think that concludes our session. Please help me again thank our amazing speakers. Thank you.
That's what I wanted to ask.